Hey, good morning, and welcome to the Comix Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club, the Kids Edition. Yay! For February of 2022. It's like we're in the future. It's the weirdest thing. We've got a great book for you. A ton of fun. It is the Batman. It's not just Batman. It's the Batman and Scooby-Doo Mysteries. And we are very lucky to have both the authors here. We have Sholly Fisch up on the top there, and Ivan Cohen right next to him. Hello, gentlemen. How are y'all today?
Good.
Hi,
Brian.
How are you?
I'm doing fine. Talking about comics on a Sunday morning. What? That's the greatest thing to do in the world, I think, at least.
Well, other than watching cartoons, but yeah.
Yeah.
I go with sleep. I go with sleep in the top slot.
Yeah.
In my Family Feud guessing.
Right.
Show me sleep.
Yeah. The problem is that sleep is just you, and then and then this is more than one person. So anyway, so hey, welcome, and let me ask you the first question. The first question is always the same question, because I love this question so much. Why comics? Of all of the different art forms that you could be participating in, what is it about comics that thrills you, that makes you excited, that just is the thing you want to do? Sholly, why don't you go first?
Oh, I've got a really good answer to that, but let's see if I can share my screen. I have a really, really good answer to that. There we go. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And are you able to see it now?
Not quite yet.
Allow it to see my screen.
No. It'll pop up on the bottom. It'll be like another person if he did it right.
There we go. Let's try that. There we go.
All right. Okay. Now you should go share that. There you go. Perfect.
So, okay. So that's me when I was about 5 years old, with my Batman pajamas and my Batman mask. And now I can stop sharing my screen. And I still have the mask.
Oh, nice.
And that is why I do comics, because I have been into comics since I was very, very young and never grew out of it. And early on, my mother said to me, when I was like 5, why are you just reading them? Why don't you make your own? And so I started making my own, and I never grew out of that either. And now I will hand it over to Ivan, because I think that set you up nicely, probably.
Sure. I don't know. When I comics hit me at the right age. I was probably 6 or 7 years old when I found some abandoned comics in the closet in my bedroom that had previously belonged to my older brothers, and I found a coverless Batman comic and a Brave and the Bold, and they were alternately. One of them was sort of famous. It's the Batman story called The Batman Nobody Knows, where Bruce Wayne takes a bunch of kids out on a camping trip, and all the kids talk about who they think Batman is. And then at the end, Bruce Wayne disappears in the shadows, and he says, "I think Batman looks like this." And he jumps out in his costume, and the children are like, "That's not what Batman looks like." and it was so weird and exciting, and I loved it. And then a couple years later, on some rainy day, which the younger people watching have to understand, when I was growing up, there was incredibly little stuff aimed at kids entertainment-wise. So it wasn't like you could park a kid in front of a TV and there'd be nonstop children's shows. So there was really not much to do. And my mom had some comics she had picked up somewhere, and she gave me them to read. And it was like part 1 of a 3-part Flash story that must have come out 6 months before. So it was about 20 years before I ever found out what happened at the end, and some other stuff. And I was hooked. I loved it. And as I grew up, my dad was and still is a freelance writer. So I had that in the back of my head as a thing. And I had writing in my head, and I've written non-comic stuff too. I know Sholly has as well. But comics is, it's not my first language, but I learned it at about the same time. And it offers the ability to create stories and show the reader exactly what you want to show them, and inspire them in a whole different way than anything else. And Batman. Batman's so cool.
Yeah.
come on. My plastic cowl that I inherited from one of my siblings is in storage somewhere, so I could not show it to you today. But it has a nice crack in the front of it because my enormous head doesn't fit in it really. Great.
See, but Ivan, you need to keep it handy because
I don't
evil
have
can
that one.
strike at any time.
I have the thing that's like a diving helmet. It's like this giant hard plastic
I know.
thing. It's probably got a little asbestos in it.
I was so envious of one of the kids in my class who had that, actually. But what are you gonna do?
Oh, I have a Batman TV show story I will share very happily. When the Batman Adam West TV show was on, which was a little before my time, although of course I watched it in reruns, my dad worked at the local ABC TV affiliate in New York. I think maybe it was publicity. He's watching now, so I'm sure I'll hear later that I don't pay attention to my father. And he got some publicity photos from the show, black and white, glossy photos. And it was such an exciting thing. And my brother, who was exactly the right age, loved them and was so excited to get them. And the way family lore goes, and I'm sure this one's true, he came to my father a couple of days later and said, can you get more of them? And my dad was like, I don't know. This was kind of a special thing. And my brother was like, but I took orders.
Oh, that's great.
I was
that's
never
really
that entrepreneurial. I really did not think it through.
That's really funny. Yeah. All right, so let me follow up on that question, and I'm going to stick with you for the second, Ivan, just because I know some of this. I know that you ended up like working directly in the offices of DC Comics. Mm-hmm. You were working with retailers like me back in the day. So how did that come about?
Oh man, well that was a magical journey of pure luck and circumstance. I graduated from college and I knew one thing for sure was that I did not want to be a freelancer. I grew up with a freelancer in my life and I was like, that seems like a lot of work. I am not going to do that. So I got out of school. I worked in a bookstore for a year. I came back to New York where I'd grown up. And the third job I had out of college, I was writing program listings for TV Guide, which back then was still kind of a big deal. So I was writing little descriptions of like 40 different TV shows every week. And it was sort of fun, but like after a year, I stopped getting better at it and I stopped being that interested. So I stayed for 2 more years. So then I was at lunch. I was at a birthday dinner for someone I went to college with. We had mutual friends, but I had actually never met her. And she was dating an editor at DC at the time. And in the course of conversation, she was like, oh, my boss is looking, she was like, yeah, you should work at DC. There's jobs. And she was like, my boss, I think, is looking for somebody. And her boss was a woman named Patty Jarrett, who Brian knows, as do I. And it was, she was looking for someone in the marketing department to write catalog descriptions of all of DC's comics, which was remarkably similar to what I was doing at TV Guide, except I like comics more than what I was writing about there. And, I had a job interview, I found out about the job in early November. I had a job offer Thanksgiving. I had my high school reunion that weekend, and I got to tell people that I was giving up watching TV for a living to go read comic books for a living. And that was very impressive to the brain surgeons and attorneys that I went to school with. And that was it. And I started at DC and I worked there for about a dozen years. I went from marketing, where I worked with retailers a lot, which I enjoyed. That was really fun. I learned a lot about how comics work. Yeah. And then I worked in editorial for a couple of years. And then my last job there, I was doing media development before the company moved to the West Coast. So I worked on a bunch of TV shows, kept some bad things from happening, made some okay things happen. Probably the best thing I worked on were either DC's direct-to-video movies, which started right around the time I started in that corner, and the Batman Brave and the Bold TV show. And in fact, I think the first time I ever worked with Sholly was when the producers of Brave and the Bold wanted to adapt one of the Batman Brave and the Bold comics that Sholly had written into an episode.
Yeah, that was bizarre.
And that never happened. That was like unheard of.
They had to actually make up a new way to do the credits at the end because they had never done anything like this before, where they were adapting a comic that was based on the TV show, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when I heard about it, I didn't hear about it directly from Ivan. I heard about it from Rachel Gluckstern, who was an editor at DC. And she told me, yeah, I hear they're going to adapt one of your stories into an episode. And I said, no, that's crazy. That's like an internet rumor. That's can't possibly be. And I kind of put it out of my mind until it turned out that, yeah, actually was happening. But yeah, you never know. You never know.
So Shelley, how did you make the move from mom saying maybe you should write some comics to writing some comics?
So, like Ivan, it was sort of by accident. So I should say first, actually, so comics is my late at night job after my family's asleep. And during the day, what I do is I've got a PhD in developmental psychology, and I do educational TV and games and stuff like that. I worked for a long time for the people who make Sesame Street, and worked on lots and lots of TV shows, Cyber Chase, Cat in the Hat, all kinds of stuff. But I finished college a semester early, and so I had like 6 months between college and graduate school, and I needed something to do. So I got myself a job for this minuscule publisher that was coming out with like its third book at the time. And I did that for a couple of months, and then a friend of mine was graduating, and so he was leaving his menial file clerk job at Marvel to take a real job with the Wall Street Journal. And I said, wait, tell him you know somebody. And so, much like Ivan, I did this menial file clerk job for a few months. And while I was there, met a guy named Sandy Hausler, who at that time was the assistant editor on Marvel Age, Marvel's promotional magazine. And he brought me to Jim Salicrup, the editor, and who saw I could put a couple of sentences together. And so for the next several years, I was doing much like Ivan. I was writing articles for Marvel Age about what was coming out and what was going to be in the comics, and doing the blurbs and doing all of that stuff. And by doing that, got to know the editors. And so I started to find out when they were looking for stories, and started writing for Marvel, and did that for several years. And through a story that's too long to tell, eventually, migrated from there over to DC, and have been doing stuff for DC and for other publishers ever since.
That's interesting.
As long as they let me do it.
It's interesting that you had had a full-time job, and we're still interested in doing sort of this promotional writing at Marvel.
Yeah, well, it helped me keep a foot in the door, and that was actually, well, so without going into the whole long story, but that's how I fell out of comics for a couple of years. Was once I was working full-time at what was then Children's Television Workshop, it's now Sesame Workshop, and I couldn't go into the office all the time. As there was more turnover among the editors, I didn't know anybody anymore, and that's how I fell out of Marvel. But again, through a story that's too long and boring to tell, eventually managed to connect with an editor at DC, got started over there, a woman named Joan Helty, who was wonderful, and gave me a chance to start doing stuff on the kids' books. And it just kind of went from there.
Yeah.
So.
I should add, I realized I left out one piece of connective tissue because I never got to the writing comics piece, which is when DC moved to the West Coast, I decided I was not going to go with them, as much as I love California and all things California, and you guys are the best.
We are.
Very convincing. Cool. So as they were leaving, I was never one of these. I had freelance written for years, for places like Vulture and Time Out New York at the time was a big deal, and I had written for those places for years in prose. I was never one of those people who was like, well, now that I'm free, I'm clearly the person who should write all the top titles at DC or Marvel. Like, I never had that ego, which has probably hurt me a little over the years, because some people have it and do very well with it. But what I did was I reached out to Christy Quinn, who at the time was editing the Green Lantern, the animated series comic, which was based on a cartoon that I'd helped develop that was about to come out. And they had a team attached already, of course, but I sort of was able to approach from the perspective of no one who doesn't work on that show knows anything about that show yet. So if you need fill-ins, I'm your guy, because you don't have to teach me anything.
Right.
I've read all the scripts. I know what the rules of that world are. And so I got to fill in with like number 4 of that issue, which was my first published comic. And then one more fill in, and then I became the regular writer just as the comic was canceled. So that was my proud beginning in writing comics. And I mostly worked in the kids space, although I've done some grown-up stuff and I have some more grown-up stuff coming. But, you know, the kids books are definitely incredibly fun. And I've been happy to get so much work in there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I want to talk more about that space in a little while. Let's jump to this though. Just because the kids attention span, sometimes they want to actually talk about the book rather than, you know, hearing us old guys blather on about old stuff. So how did you guys get involved in this? Now, if my memory is correct, Batman and Scooby-Doo was not native to the comics, right? There was some other form it came out in first. Is that right?
This year is actually the 50th anniversary of the first meeting of Batman and Scooby-Doo.
Oh, neat.
Wow.
Yes.
Someone did research.
You know what? I have the internet. But the first one was a couple of episodes of the new Batman of the new Scooby-Doo movies that guest starred Batman. And then there have been a couple others on TV since then. But how I came to the series was, before this series, I was writing a series called the Scooby-Doo Team Up, which actually started out when they first approached me about it, was supposed to be a one-shot special that was going to be a Batman Scooby-Doo special. And so it was Christy, actually, the same, just as Ivan was saying. Christy had contacted me and asked me if I was interested in pitching stories for it. And so I said, sure. And so I sent them, like, I don't know, maybe 4 different ideas, figuring they'd pick the one they liked best. And she said, you know what? After seeing all these things that you had in mind, they decided we're going to change it from a one-shot special to a 6-issue miniseries. I said, great. And I started working on it. And then maybe a month or 2 later, as I was working on it, she contacted me and said, you know, they realized they could really expand this out, not just to Batman. And so we're going to make this an ongoing series with the entire DC universe. And it'll be Scooby-Doo Team Up. And so my one-shot special turned into a 50-issue series. And so when that was over, which was kind of a shame because I really enjoyed it, when this one came along, it was a natural. There was no way I was going to say no to it. But I'll turn it over to Ivan now, so you can say how you got into it.
Sure. And let me just say, Scooby Team Up is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I had written some issues of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Over the years, and I had also written Beware the Batman, which was that one started as an ongoing and became a 6-issue miniseries. So we went to reverse distance because the cartoon it was based on, which I wrote 1 episode of, was canceled incredibly, like basically when number 2 of the series came out. So that was shocking. But so I had some Batman experience and some Scooby experience, and the editor, Michael McAllister, was someone I had worked with a bunch on sort of special, weird custom projects at DC that don't go through comic shops. But, you know, I had written comics that appeared on the back of ice cream packages and, you know, sugary, chewy candies. And I think they thought that the schedule, it was going to come out 10 pages every 2 weeks. Was it weekly or
I think it was 10 pages every week, and it was going to be
10 pages
a month. That's why they needed both of us.
Right. It was going to be 10 pages a week on, you know, released digitally first with the print version later. And so they wanted co-writers to make sure that we never fell behind. So I was super excited to be on it. And I was excited to work with Sholly, whose work I liked a lot, but it was fun to, you know, it was fun to be competing. It was fun to sort of be like, oh, you're using that guy. Well, I'm going to use this one. Yeah. See how that worked out. And it was really fun. And I got to read Sholly's scripts, which I never had before, which was really taught me a lot.
Well, I will say in return, Yes, Ivan and I often wind up writing for the same things, and I've had story ideas rejected from like Looney Tunes or Teen Titans Go because Ivan has already written that story. Um, and
Sorry.
the same thing actually happened here when I pitched, my story ideas for Batman Scooby. Immediately, Michael said, "Well, you can't do that one because Ivan's doing that in issue number 1." So I changed it, and it became the story for issue number 6. So Ivan had in issue number 1 Batman and Scooby time traveling back to their early days, to Batman Year One days. And so I said, well, okay, if he's going to go back to like Batman's first year as Batman, I'm going to do a story from before he was Batman. And had, kid Bruce Wayne with, a pup named Scooby-Doo learning how to be detectives. So, so it's actually been a lot of fun that we do have very similar sensibilities in a lot of ways. And when one of us comes up with an idea before the other one, and I still, to this day, I cannot believe that in 50 issues of Scooby Team Up, I never thought of having Shaggy with the Shaggy Man until Ivan thought of it. But
My
but
legacy.
but when one of us comes up with something, then it forces the other one to come up with something, and try to top it, and it's really been a lot of fun.
It has been fun. I had an idea that because of what you ended up doing in issue 6, that I couldn't figure out a way to make it work, and as it turned out, it was too crowded an issue anyway. In issue number 1, when they're in the Year One diverse, at one point I wanted only a couple of members of the Scooby Gang travel back in time, and I actually wanted them to meet like infant, baby, or toddler Daphne. I couldn't quite figure out a way to work, but it was going to be like them, doing a classic Scooby run down a street, and like somebody was going to have dropped their doll or something, and it was going to be, little redheaded baby Daphne. But I couldn't find a way to make it work that wasn't just, me having fun. And
Right.
it turns out the readers are supposed to have fun too.
Well, and actually, I mean, the pup named Scooby-Doo thing turned out really cool for another reason, which is that was one of the issues drawn by Scott Geralds. And Scott was actually one of the guys who designed the pup named Scooby-Doo characters for Hanna-Barbera. Yeah, so that was really, I mean, I'd worked with Scott before, and he's a really nice guy. But yeah, he was the one who actually told me that it was a magnifying glass that little Velma was carrying around, not a giant lollipop. So,
great.
Yeah,
that's kind of cool. So I'm assuming then that DC came to y'all with we want to do 12 issues of this rather than you going to them and pitching it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we would have loved to do 100.
Yeah, we would not have said 12 issues. That number would not have been, you never tell them when to end it. They've also started doing in some other places. There's been some, like Capstone has published some Batman Scooby-Doo like books for younger readers, and there may have been one more Batman Scooby-Doo video in the last year or two. So definitely someone in the Warner Brothers machinery thinks these are tastes that go great together.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And how did the division of labor end up working out? Like in terms of, are you guys literally trading off issues, or are you pitching ideas and then they went, oh well, he has 6 and he has 6, we'll make this work trading off? Did that parse as a question?
Sure. Do I know the answer? No. We had the ideas, and then I think apart from choosing what the first issue was going to be, which was mine because I won, Sholly. I won.
Just because Michael likes you better.
Oh. We're not the Smothers Brothers, for a reference that no one watching will get. Dad liked you best. Once we had the first issue established, then it was sort of trading off, although fairly quickly in the line, I fell a little behind. And they were alternating. There was all sorts of mechanics with who was drawing the issues. So we ended up each of us did 6 issues, but they didn't quite alternate, basically. The long-winded non-answer. But
yeah, and I mean, the only thing I would add to that is, mostly I try to get way ahead of schedule, just because since I'm doing 2 jobs, I never know when I'm gonna hit a stumbling block, and I don't want to fall behind. But every once in a while, there are also issues that I know should be sort of at the end. So number 12 is the grand finale for the season, for the series rather, with a lot of stuff that I'm not going to say because it would just be spoilers. But let's just say, because you'll see it on the cover, it's got everybody in the Batman family. And I knew that that needed to be issue 12 because what would you possibly follow that with? So for the most part, we did switch back and forth, but every once in a while there was something like that that just needed to be in a certain place, and so we kind of planned around it.
Yeah.
My last. Sorry.
I wonder about sort of the nature and the history of Batman, because Batman has been kind of many different characters over the decades. Is there, does it make it easier or harder when you're trying to come up with stories to sort of navigate that big history of Batman? I thought of this particularly when you say, oh, the whole Batman family's in it, in issue 12. I mean, that's like 40 characters, right? You know, and how do you fit all of that in and also have a story and then also even have the Scooby-Doo characters in there at all? Because the Scooby-Doo characters are basically, you know, 5 guys and Scrappy sometimes, you know, and that's it.
Yeah.
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 It's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's wonderful about Batman is that because he has been so many different versions over the years, and because we are doing kids comics that are not in regular DC continuity, we can pick whichever ones we want. I have, you know, in Scooby Team Up, I did an issue that was a parody of The Dark Knight. I did issues that came from the 40s. The issue that I was talking about where they go back and meet the young Bruce Wayne was inspired by a story from the 1950s when Batman was Robin.
Right.
And, you know, so we have the freedom to do that. We can pull out whatever our favorite stuff is and we can make it work. And I just find that incredibly fun in a way that, you know, when I've done regular DCU stuff, I enjoy doing that stuff too, you know, but you have a lot more rules in place that you can't violate. And here, as long as you're true to the characters, you know, the sandbox is wide open, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for me, I mean, I would never have gone thinking about it this, you know, deep and serious, but I sort of go with the writer Grant Morrison when he was working on Batman, sort of approached it from the attitude that every Batman story that ever happened is legit. Like they all happened, every single one of them. And I sort of felt like that was the toolbox, the toy box we had to play with here was, oh, if I want Batman, a thing that sort of references a Batman story from 30 years ago, it's fine. As long as the kids will understand it, as long as I'm not requiring them to have bought those comics, which would be insane, we're in a good place. If we can actually, I have an example that I think sort of relates to what Sholly was talking about. I gave you guys a couple of pieces of art for the for the cover.
Yeah. You want the cover one? That one?
Yeah, that one.
Yep.
So that's the cover to Batman Scooby-Doo Mysteries #1, which was came from the suggestion I had made for what it should be. And if you go to the next cover, that would be one of the reference points, which is Batman number 407, I think, which is the 4th part of Batman Year One. And that's from the early 80s. But of course, that's not where that comes from, because if you go to the next one, that would be Batman number 9 from 1941.
Right.
So, you know, that's all in there in the mix. I mean, you know, we're thinking about all this stuff. The book I was holding up before, which I know I gave you the cover of, I can just show you my copy of it. This is Batman from the 30s to the 70s, published in 1971. I'm sure I didn't buy it then.
Oh, I did.
You were very precocious, because I know you're a young man, much like myself. But you know, that was a book that had all the stories together. I mean, I think there's part of that that informs all this. I don't know if Sholly feels the same, but like I was watching Super Friends on Saturday mornings, and in the afternoons I was watching reruns of the Adam West Batman, and I was reading this giant hardcover that had stories from 40 different years of Batman stories. And I mean, they were organized by decade, but I wasn't paying attention. I was just like, what's the next story? So in my head, that's all Batman. There's not one Batman, there's a million Batman. You know, Batman is this guy who has these cool adventures, and sometimes they're a little sillier than they are other times, but it's all Batman. That's fine.
Yeah.
I love writing Batman comics where Batman can smile. That's, you know, I think.
Yeah,
I think
and you kind of can't do that in modern Batman comics very often, at least.
Smile about in those comics.
Yeah.
In those comics.
Yeah. No, I agree. Comparatively, though, Scooby-Doo really hasn't changed in 50, 60 years.
Yes and no, because that was actually my last issue of Scooby Team Up, was the Crisis of Infinite Scoobies. And it teamed up the original Scooby Gang, the Scooby Apocalypse Gang, the Mystery Inc. Scooby Gang, the live action movie Scooby Gang, etc., etc., etc. And it's not as diverse as Batman over the years, but you know, when you've got the little kid Daphne next to the Daphne with the giant gun that wants to shoot everything,
Right.
You got a pretty good range.
Right.
I also think that one thing that's been nice with the comics is where we have, I think, a freedom that they probably do on the animated stuff now, where like, you know, Daphne contributes more. Like if you read like classic Scooby-Doo show Bible stuff, it's like Velma's the smart one. Daphne is clumsy. And it's like, no, I can't do that. I can't tell stories for children where the only thing one of the characters does is like fall down. I mean, that's not that is not it. That's not that everything has to be empowering and uplifting, but it should at least show that there's a reason these kids hang around together. Otherwise, it would just be Velma by herself solving crimes.
I mean,
much faster. Much faster.
Actually would be, yeah. But I mean, one of the things that I've written well over 100 Scooby-Doo stories between regular Scooby and Scooby Team Up and this and whatever. And one of the things that I very intentionally did at some point along the line was I said, all right, we got to do something about Daphne. And fans had sort of derisively referred to her as danger-prone Daphne because all she ever did was get in trouble. And so I decided to run with that. And I made her danger-prone Daphne the one who constantly rushes into danger to protect other people. And just turn the whole thing around. I've also established that running around and screaming is part of their crime-solving process. So, yeah.
Good stuff.
You know, you take the basic elements and you make them work. You know, you make them work for modern day because they're all different eras and it needs to work and feel contemporary as well as being that sort of timeless whatever.
Yeah, I think that when I think back through my kid filter, because that's when I watched most of the Scooby-Doos that I've watched. I always kind of felt like it was Scooby and Shaggy's show, and the rest were just there to like move the plot along a little bit, but it was always Scooby and Shaggy that was it. So is that a challenge in writing a Scooby-Doo story to actually give the others enough to do that justifies them? Does that make sense? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it really depends on what the story is. I purposely do stories that feature different characters. Shaggy and Scooby are by far, you know, the funniest, and that makes them the easiest to write. But I've done stories that feature each of the others for exactly that reason, because I don't want it all to be that. Really, what I've found, having written so ridiculously much Scooby-Doo in my lifetime, is, you know, the real challenge to me for Scooby-Doo is that the original show was so formulaic. that the trick has always been to figure out something new to do with it. And sometimes I've done that by putting in I did a Scooby-Doo story that was all parodies of Alfred Hitchcock movies, things like that. Sometimes I've taken those basic elements and kind of turned them on their heads, and I've done stories where where the monster turns out not to really be a monster, not just because, and not through any criminal anything, and it's because somebody else is manipulating them, and I've found ways to play with those basic conventions so that they have all the basic elements of a Scooby-Doo story, but it's something you haven't seen before. And that makes it more interesting for me, and it makes it more interesting for the readers. Once you start teaming Scooby up with somebody else, like Batman, say, then suddenly you can tell whole other kinds of stories. Because now it's not always going to be, old Mr. Crinchley who was trying to buy up the farm. You can do Batman's Rogues Gallery. You can do all kinds of things that you couldn't have done otherwise. And that's what really kind of keeps it fresh and fun for me.
Yeah, but at the same token, doesn't it gets kind of far away from the Scooby formula, right? Like if it's one of Batman's Rogue Gallery, you can't have them pull off the mask at the end, and I would have gotten away with, you know what I mean? Like,
oh, sure you can, Brian.
Oh, I've done that.
Sure you can. These things are much more elastic than you imagine. I think Shelley had sort of a secret contest to see how many unmaskings you could have in one issue.
Yeah. Every
there's
issue
one where I did a lot. There's like masks on top of masks.
Yeah, every issue I try to do at least one unmasking and at least one mention of the phrase meddling kids.
Right.
Yeah. I enjoyed in issue 1, there's a point where year 1 Batman has one of those sort of narration captions of the style of that book, where he talks about, if these kids really are time travelers, I have to stop them before they meddle with any, and I'm like, that's as close as I'm getting, because Batman is not really going to call them meddling kids. But
right.
But no, I mean, I find the hardest thing, it was harder in the regular Scooby-Doo comic, where the stories these days are 10 pages. It's really hard. I find it really hard to have there be any actual mystery about who the criminal is. Like, there's the gang, there's the person who introduces them into the story, and there's the creature. And if the creature is secretly someone who's in the story, I guess it's going to be the one other person they met. So trying to figure out ways to make that surprising, or
right.
I agree with Shelley. I think motivations are fun. I've done most of the Scooby-Doo stories I've written that don't have Batman in them. Either the villains are sort of the victims themselves and sort of don't end up being carried off to jail, or the alternative is they've done something terrible. I think the first or second Scooby story I wrote had a fake ghost in the White House, and it was sort of like, at the end of the story, I was just like, well, that person's going to prison forever, because you don't actually get to break into the White House and and just have it be like a lovable story. But we don't. Don't worry, kids. Everyone's fine.
Yeah.
You didn't make it be the vice president?
No. Shush. Shut up, Charlie.
Oh, that's funny. That challenge of trying to write a 10-page Scooby-Doo story seems like a really, really, really big challenge to me. Because even in the half-hour cartoons, it was always really obvious, even when I was 6, like, who the villain was. I don't know that I was very often surprised by, oh no, it was Old Man Jones. Like, well, obviously it was Old Man Jones. He was the guy who was being grumpy and mean the whole time.
Well, so years ago, this was probably, I don't know, 15 years ago or something now. While I was writing stuff for the regular Scooby book, I started doing a series of things that were like solve it yourself mysteries with the Scooby Gang, and it was 2 pages of the mystery, and then there would be a half page in the back that would have the reveal, and so there'd be a couple of them in the comic. And trying to write a Scooby story in 2 pages That's hard. And what I learned to do in order to make that work was you start in the middle. You forget about all the setup, you forget about all the going to wherever they're getting to, and you just pick it up right in the middle of the story with the creature, with the whatever. And so compared to that, 10 pages is a luxury. But Ivan's right. I mean, it is hard. That is probably the hardest part of it, is how to have any mystery whatsoever. And so when I'm doing those 10 pages, I do try to make sure that there are at least 2 credible suspects, so that, you know, it's pretty obvious it's going to be one of them, but maybe not as obvious which one it's going to be. But yeah. But then Batman Scooby, we get to do 20 pages, and so the sky's the limit.
That took me a while to figure out, to sort of relearn how to tell a story with that much room. I was like, all right, I'm done. I'm on page 11. Oh, I guess we need to add some things because the ghost has to show up again. But it's so fun. I mean, the hard part, and I've sort of, I think in stuff that's going to be in the second volume, talks about this a little, where there's like, you know, the gang has kind of figured out, so like Batman likes having them around because clearly he doesn't really need them to solve the mysteries. He's the world, you know, he's the world's greatest detective by a very large margin over Velma, and then Velma's the world's second greatest detective, very far above everyone else. So between the two of them, it shouldn't take them 20 pages, but Batman's having fun. And these are, you know, fairly harmless crime stories.
That makes a lot of sense. Where do you stand on the article of the before Batman? Is he Batman or is he the Batman?
Depends on context.
In these comics, I'd say he's Batman. I think in the Batman and Scooby-Doo mysteries, I think the refers to the mysteries.
The mysteries, yeah.
Not to the Batman.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah.
As
a little bit, yeah.
March with the release of the new film.
But sometimes it works nicely. You know, it really depends on the line and who's saying it more than anything else. But yeah, you stick in the when you want them to be a little more intimidating.
That makes sense. So what's your guys' process of writing? Do you are you starting off with just a pitch that the editor has to approve? Do you start writing a full script? How does your, and I'm sure you guys probably have somewhat individual processes as well.
Less so than you'd think. I think there's a lot similar in what we do. It starts with a pitch. Then the pitch has to go to the editor, who first was Michael McAllister, then became Christy Quinn through some magical transformation. And then besides going to the editor, it also needs to go to somebody at Warner Brothers, who has to approve it because they oversee Hanna-Barbera and all of that. And then once there's the approval, then it is straight to script. I hate working Marvel method where you do the plot and the dialogue later. I really much prefer working a full script so that I can figure out how I want to structure the pages and the pacing and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then it's a full script, and you know, sometimes they'll come back with a few notes. Usually it's not too bad. Sometimes they'll just take it the way it is and, you know, and run with it. But, Ivan, anything different for you?
No, I mean, I guess usually in the pitch form with these, there's like a short paragraph, and usually in that, if I really want to make life hard for myself in the short term and then better for myself in the long term, I include in that paragraph, like, you know, if it's a regular Scooby story, like who the bad guy is and why they're doing the thing, just so I sort of have that in my head. And with the Batman stories, it's a little less necessary, but still the same kind of thing. And then I usually try to break it down by what happens on each page, just so I make sure I have enough story and I have enough runway to get to the end. I find the hardest part of those comics is the sort of the last page where everything, you know, it's like, how do you explain everything that happened, have the bad guy get caught? Because once the bad guy is revealed and is caught, you don't really want there to be a whole another page of babbling. but my last pages tend to be a little crowded, but that's basically how it works. There have been times where I haven't had the page breakdown stuff worked out as well, and hopefully the readers can't tell, but I can, because the writing slows down dramatically, because I'm like, I don't know what happens now. I have no idea what happens now. Yeah. I'd better add 6 more jokes here, and then I have to sometimes go back to the beginning and add them in earlier, and like that just gets to be a mess. So it is better. I find for myself, it is way better to work from an outline and have a plan.
Do either of you like storyboard out your own comics, or sort of make a visual thing so that you can see how it's flowing?
Yes and no. I mean, if I drew well enough to do all of that, then I'd be drawing comics, but I don't. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this because it's all in pencil, but this is kind of my first step. I just take a piece of paper, break it into 8 boxes, and that's like 8 pages of the comic, and just scribble notes to myself of what's going where. And much like Ivan said, it's what allows me to make sure that I have the right number of pages for the story I want to tell, and if I'm short someplace where I need to flesh stuff out, if I've got too much story where I need to cut stuff like that. And then from there, I go into writing the script, and usually what I do, I usually do it in stages. First, I'll go through and I'll write up all the panel descriptions. And then I'll go back and do my second pass, which is when I put in all the dialogue. And that gives me the opportunity to then see, oh, I need an extra panel here. There's too much dialogue in this panel. Or, oh, I need to cut a couple panels over there or move this over here or something like that. I used to, after doing that pencil breakdown of all of the pages, I used to go panel by panel, but I've been doing this a long time and I just don't take the time for that anymore. And I just do it in the course of writing the script.
Yeah, it's interesting because it sort of looks like your 8 panel or 8-page breakdown there is very similar to what an artist does in terms of doing thumbnails, but you're doing your thumbnails with words. Exactly. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, exactly.
What's funny is here's where we differ. I actually tend to do dialogue first and visuals later.
Oh, that's interesting.
It may just be because my brain is wired for jokes as opposed to, dramatic storytelling in the visual medium, which could be a problem. But if we have this will be of interest very quickly. If you can go to that PowerPoint segment.
Sure, absolutely.
This is a thing that I adapted from a thing I totally stole from Shay Fontana. So if she's watching, thanks, Shay. This was from when I was doing Teen Titans Go a lot. This is actually from the last issue. That covers by Eric Owen, because we should credit artists all the time. But if you go to if you flip through the next page, this is what my script stuff looks like. If you look closely, you can see it has fart emoji, which is how you know it's good comics for children. And then you go ahead a little further. That's the panel descriptions. But if you go one more, I think we have. Okay, go one more. That's Sandy Gerald's art, but this is Sandy's layouts for the issue I had done. As Teen Titans Go 71 digitally. It's number 36 in print.
Nice.
But there you can see the layout, the final layout and the finished art. And then on the next page, you can see it lettered with drawing. And then the final one, I think, the finished comic. Look at that. Yep. Look, visual aids.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into making comics, huh?
It's crazy. I sometimes, if I think too much about how much work I'm making for an artist to draw stuff, I get sort of locked up. It's sort of like, oh, why am I asking for 7 panels? Surely 2 panels would work,
right?
Because I do occasionally apologize to artists. And when you see the final issue of Batman Scooby, you'll see why I sent a very apologetic email to Dario Brizuela afterwards and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, and I won't do this next time."
Dario's so good, and
Dario's wonderful,
and that issue's great. That issue is just fantastic.
Yeah,
we do get to each other's stuff before it comes out.
Do you because of the multiple artists working on these, do you know who's going to be drawing your scripts going in or not?
Usually, I think.
Sort of, kind of. I mean, Dario's been drawing most of them, and occasionally, like the one that Scott drew with the pup named Scooby-Doo characters, I specifically asked for Scott because I knew he had designed them. But a lot of the time, I have no idea. But you know, there's sort of a pool of people that tend to work on the DC Kids books, so I'm generally sure it's going to be one of them, even if I don't know specifically which. And you know, people like Dario, or you know, or some of the other artists that I've worked with, I've been working with them for like 20 years at this point, so we kind of know each other's work, you know. And some of them, because they live in other countries, I've either never met or I've met, you know, once or twice. Dario lives in South America, so I see him, well, before COVID, I would see him once a year at a convention, and that was it. But we know each other's work well enough, and we communicate by email and all of that, that we kind of know what each other's looking for.
Yeah. Most of the kids' comics are done in more or less a house style. Have you had situations where you've written something and been surprised by what you got back from the artist? Or does that not happen very often in the kids space?
Oh, that happens. That's how I've learned to put in tons of art reference in the back. Because, well, okay, so I'll give you the quick example from a kid comic, and then I'll give you the slightly more example from years ago at Marvel. Quick example from a kid comic was, what was it? I think it was a Looney Tunes story where I had one of the characters spraying the other with a giant seltzer bottle. And it didn't occur to me that I don't remember which artist it was, but it's one of the South American artists. But in South America, they didn't have seltzer bottles that sprayed. And so, and I didn't mean like a screw off top bottle. But the funnier example, many years ago, I used to write for a humor comic that Marvel did called What the? And there was a story that I wrote where it was around the time that the Vision had his mind and personality wiped and he was much more robotic again. So I did a story in What the, where the Scarlet Witch, who was still married to him at that time, took him to the mall to go buy a new personality because she was really tired of it. And so the whole story was him just changing from one to another and to another and to another. And at one point, I had him turn into a Smurf, and because I get very annoyed by Smurfs. And so and we didn't call it Smurf. And so in the dialogue, it was like, "Oh, what a Snorpy day!" Da 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 da. Right. I did not realize until the comic was in print that the artist apparently did not know what a Smurf was, because near as I can tell from looking at the published story, he thought that Smurf was some sort of slang term for an effeminate middle-aged man, because suddenly the Vision turns into this middle-aged man saying, "Oh, what a Snorpy day." And that's how I've learned that every one of my, well, almost every one of my scripts has at least a couple of pages in the back of art reference for anything that I think the artist might not know. And that's true for when I'm pulling out obscure old Batman characters, or when I'm pulling out things like a seltzer bottle or anything like that. And that helps to avoid an awful lot of problems.
Wow. That's pretty good.
Do you have any stories like that, Ivan? Or
nothing nearly that good. I will say, I mean, with Batman Scooby, I sort of expect, we're very lucky that we have very good artists on it, all the way through 1 through 12. I sort of think that there's a certain understanding that like you're going to get the Batman and Scooby characters kind of the way you picture them in your head from cartoons and stuff. I did a Scooby issue recently where there's a new artist who I think maybe has worked with Sholly now too. What is his name? Valerio Chiola. Do you know?
I think it's Valerie, actually. I think it's
Is it Valerie?
But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. We did one story together. Actually, we did
Valerio here.
Oh, we did
this
one story together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did this one.
But like,
Yeah,
if you look
okay.
at, if I can keep the glare from being too dramatic, but you can see, I mean, that's clearly Daphne, that's clearly Shaggy and Scooby, but it's a little more, it's a little more lively than sometimes stuff that's done directly from licensed style guides can be.
Yeah.
And that was exciting. Like, that was exciting when I saw those. The editor had told me, oh, we're going to put somebody new. And I was like, great. You know, always happy to, you know, find new people. And I saw that. I was just like, this is great. This makes it really, you know, this makes it more fun for me to see the story come to life, and hopefully for the readers too. But
yeah,
it was like that on Titans Go. There was an artist who worked with me a lot on that book named Marcello Di Chiara.
I love Marcello.
He's fantastic. I mean, it was one of those things where, like, he was so fantastic, he got to go work on DC Superhero Girls, and, you know, we didn't get to work together again for a while. And I was like, all right, you're glad. Then he ended up helping on the Space Jam graphic novel that I did, and that was it was nice to be reunited with the old team.
Yeah, Marcello. We should, just to give him his proper due, Marcello actually drew my Teen Titans Go graphic novel. Teen Titans Go. Yeah. And the thing I love about, and apart from the fact that he's just really good, Marcello, and I don't know if you can see this, but I can trust, he's one of those artists that I can trust that whatever I put into the script, he's going to add lots of additional sight gags and stuff, and do it well. So I don't know if you can see this food fight here with the Titans, but, you know, the book is just full of this stuff with all these little things that you could just spend ages just looking in the background at all the fun stuff that's going on.
And was that something that you just wrote, like they have a food fight?
I think I put in a few of the gags, you know, and then I said, you know, feel free to add whatever else you want. And so he did. You know, it's the Teen Titans going to Camp Apocalypse in Apocalypse. And so they're, you know, it's hard to do anything in Apocalypse and not make it really, really funny. So,
So one of the things you you said earlier is that you write the synopsis and it goes to your editor, then it goes sort of up the chain to a Warner's person. Because both of you, most of the stuff that you've been working on has been in, you know, kind of this license space, as it were, where you're working on cartoons or existing properties. How often do things get bounced back from the toppest levels of, oh no, the character wouldn't do this, or oh no, this is not an appropriate story for this this premise, or whatever?
So with the Scooby stuff, not so often, because, and I'm sure this is true for Ivan too, but just because I've been doing this so long at this point that I think there's a certain level of trust built up. I've worked on a lot of licensed stuff at a lot of different companies, not just at DC, and I've had a real range of experiences from licensors who are perfectly fine with everything and have nothing to say and just like what I'm doing, and that's that, to things where I've had to go through 5 drafts of something before finally satisfying all their things, and often because it's not until the 3rd draft that they actually express in words what it really was that they were objecting to. And that's frustrating, obviously. But for the most part, I've been pretty lucky with all of that. I've had pretty sensible people that I've been working with, and so it's mostly been fun. But there's good days and there's bad days, and with the DC stuff, it's way more good than bad.
That's pretty much been my experience. I mean, also we're fortunate that the editors we've worked with kind of know the territory also. So part of the screening process might be that we propose 4 things and they take the 2 they like most at the intersection of what they like most with what they know won't get pushback.
Right.
Conceptually from the license, the person who reviews the license stuff. I mean, I don't know if Sholly has had this kind of experience. There's a cliche in Hollywood, like a Hollywood cliche of like, if they ask the actor, do you know how to ride a horse? You always say yes, to be in the movie. Like you never say, I can't ride a horse, so they don't give you the part.
Right.
There may have been a licensed project or 2 where I claimed a greater knowledge of a property than I actually had and then had to, cram very quickly. And that has sometimes, has bitten me a little bit. But there was one time I worked on a project. I'll name names. I did a Lego Ninjago comic based on the movie that was coming out a couple of years ago. And the feedback we got at one point was that the main character shouldn't be having so much self-doubt. And when the movie came out, the driving thing was that the character was consumed with self-doubt.
Right.
What happened? Why? But
well, this is the question I kind of wanted to get at broadly, and not naming names and not naming specific things, but how often is the person who is sort of the licensed person actually connected to the property versus someone who's kind of just an intern, as it were, doing the job, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I couldn't tell you who's actually doing the stuff over there because I'm not there, but I have had experiences, again, not naming any names, but I have had experiences where it became, where one of 2 things happened. They're both frustrating. One is, and also sort of amusing at the same time. One is the exact same thing that I've been talking about, where I've done something in the comic and I've been told you can't do that. And then when the movie has come out or the whatever has come out, it's full of the exact same thing. I've also had experiences where it was very clear to me that I actually knew more about the characters than the person who was reviewing it. Right. Because the things they were objecting to were things that I knew came straight from the characters. And so there are times when I've been able to come back to my editor and point this out and show it, and then they go back to the licensor and it's all, fine and dandy. And there are times when I just kind of give in to whatever it is and I change it, even though I know it's kind of silly. If it's not something that's really, life and death kind of thing. It's like anything, you have in any job, you have people who are really, really good and you have people who are not as good, maybe. And, you hope that you're working with the ones that are really, really good, and you learn to work with the ones that are not as,
Sure.
And I have to say, I mean, editorially, I have been blessed to work with some wonderful, wonderful editors. Christie being, one of the top ones as far as I'm concerned, who's doing Batman Scooby now. Editors who were, I remember working on Super Friends and saying to Rachel Gluckster and my editor, I think I'd like to put Batmite in the next issue. And she said, okay, why don't you put Mr. Mxyzptlk in there too? And you get those editors who just will run with you no matter how ridiculous the idea you've come up with is. And that's just a joy. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that's nice is when you occasionally do run into, not on the editorial side, but on the licensing side, sort of an overseer who maybe has not as much familiarity with the stuff or has been given one instruction that they've maybe overinterpreted a little to be the main thing. As long as it's not a huge part of the story, these things are elastic enough that you sort of pick your battles. It's like,
sure.
Do I really have to call it Gotham City every time because someone said that it can never just be called Gotham? I mean, it's not the way it is in movies, TV shows, and every comic book, but okay, sure, I can change this one place here because it doesn't change
Right.
It doesn't change the story very much, and nobody but me is ever going to know I got that note.
Right.
It's if it was other stuff, then you pick your battles. You fight the things that are important. If someone said to me, "You can't have Daphne drive the mystery machine because that's Fred's job," I'd be like, "Well, Fred can do other stuff. Like let the
I've had somebody say that.
let the nice lady drive to get into more danger."
I've gotten that note, actually.
Yeah.
Really?
Crazy.
Oh yeah. And and so I said, all right, fine. Put Fred over there, put Daphne next to him. Not that big a deal.
I think I got away with it because there was some joke that required that Fred not be the one driving. But
is you've been writing Shally Scooby-Doo for many years, decades even.
Yeah, hard to believe.
Right? Has the nature of what is and is not acceptable changed over those years, particularly in terms of the female characters? And because I think society has changed over the last 10 or 15 years about what you can do and what you cannot. Has that been reflected in how things are being received?
Probably. I mean, they have cell phones now. I always wrote the female characters as strong, so I didn't run into that kind of stuff. I actually remember on Looney Tunes, and this is going back 20-something years now, when Joan Hilty was still editing it, and I wrote a Pepe Le Pew story because my wife loves Pepe Le Pew, and I'd never written Pepe. And I wrote a story about him basically being a one-man football team. And so there wasn't any of the uncomfortable, male-female stuff that haunts Pepe now. And I remember, giving the script to Joan, and she read it, and she said, "Wow, you actually wrote a Pepe Le Pew story that I can feel comfortable with." So I was conscious that, bear in mind that, I used to work for the people who make Sesame Street. So, so I've always been conscious of this stuff. And occasionally I run into something that, is completely inadvertent that I didn't take into account that an editor will call me out on. It actually happened. It happened with Batman Scooby number 12 when I took out a joke about Zebra Man's stripes being slimming. So occasionally I'll run into something like that, and it's usually pretty easy to fix. But as far as any big stuff is concerned, I was always writing like that, so it hasn't really affected me much. I don't know.
Sure, because I was, like you just brought up Sesame Street, and certainly Sesame Street has changed over the years in terms of what characters can be there, and even interpersonal relationships between the characters. I don't know that 20 years ago you would have had, characters who are sensitive to sound. That's a very weird example, but. The inclusiveness is a lot higher today than it was in the past.
Yes and no. I mean, the wonderful thing about Sesame is constantly evolving. That's why it's still around after 50 years. The first season was called the first experimental season, and as far as I know, I think the 50th season was called the 50th experimental season. But bear in mind, when Sesame went on the air for the first time in 1969. It was pretty much just about the only show on television that had an ethnically mixed cast. And actually Sonia Manzano, who played Maria for years and years, she tells a story about how she was in college and was walking past a TV in the student center or some such place, and Sesame Street was on. And she stopped in her tracks because there were people who looked like her on the screen. And that was the moment that she decided that that's what she wanted to do. So, it was always doing that. It's just that the boundaries that it was pushing then have already been pushed. So now they're pushing different ones. And I think, honestly, I think it's a healthy thing. You know, by the same token, when I was a kid, all superheroes, you know, were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you know, and once we started having black superheroes, I got really into them. And it wasn't until years later. I mean, part of it was just because I really liked Luke Cage and I really liked Black Lightning and I really liked those characters. But it wasn't until years later that I realized that part of it was probably that it was another few years after that before we ever got a Jewish superhero.
Mm.
And so I think part of it for me was just these guys were different. And so I look now, and now now we've got Muslim superheroes, and we've got gay superheroes, we've got whatever. And I think it's a lot healthier when you're in that kind of landscape where everybody can look and see themselves. And so I'm really very supportive of all of that, and that far outweighs any minimal embarrassment I might have when they inadvertently make a slimming joke or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. I've had some character issue stuff with, I mean, the places where it's stuff like Teen Titans Go, Robin's interest in Starfire there is a very fine line you can walk between it being hilarious and fun, and boy, it's creepy that he doesn't take no for an answer. Boy, it's bizarre and frightening. And I did a story that my editor pushed back a little on one part of it, which had not occurred to me as an issue, that when Robin was building a robot duplicate of Starfire, that it seemed like there was some creepy aspect to it, which was not intended, but I was like, oh, well, yeah, let's fix that. That's simple enough. I find the hardest place, I think there are two areas. One is Looney Tunes comics, because so many characters, there's so much stuff based on violence or impending violence. You're not going to see a lot of Yosemite Sam stories anymore. Like, it's just not, hilarious gunplay is not really a flavor in entertainment, and it shouldn't be, but it's hard to do duck season, rabbit season when no one's hunting. Like there's sort of, those things are trickier to navigate. Shally and I both worked on I believe we both worked on a comic that never came out for the Tom and Jerry Walmart comic.
Oh, did that never come out?
It never came out. It never came out.
No wonder I never got a copy.
And I was bummed because it was going to be the first Tom and Jerry comic in decades and decades and decades. And one of the instructions, and I never saw the new movie, so I don't know to what extent this was continued there, was, well, they're not trying to kill each other. They're more like roommates that don't really get along. And I was like, sure, that sounds like Tom and Jerry. So, one of the stories I wrote basically lifted a plot from an Odd Couple episode involving like a cooking contest, because I was really just like, I don't know what to do if they're not really trying to hurt each other. Like, they're just mad. I mean, I'm married and I have a kid, so I guess I'm familiar with being incredibly angry at people you live with that you can't actually hurt. But, it's different when it's a cartoon cat and mouse. The other thing that's challenging with the absolutely legit and appropriate focus on diversity is when you deal with characters like the Scooby Gang, where, they kind of all have to appear the way they have always been represented. And again, in that 10-page format. So the diversity of, skin color and body types tends to come from the additional characters. But if you only have 2 additional characters, you don't want to have it be like, it's only the white characters who can be the villain.
Right.
Lame. That's a stereotype of itself. But you don't want it to always be the reverse either. So it's a constant juggling act of like, how do you make a diverse world for these characters when the ones with speaking parts are mostly not diverse?
And how do you solve that? That actually, now that you've said it out loud, wow, that makes a lot of sense. That seems like an incredible challenge in doing comics with Scooby-Doo.
You do it with the supporting cast.
Yeah.
The current issue of Scooby-Doo, set in a police station, and the desk sergeant, who is the primary character in that one, other than the gang, is black. Um, I've done a Scooby-Doo Hanukkah story where the ghost of the evil ruler Antiochus is stealing all the oil and candles for the lighting, and so you get some cultural stuff in that way. I've done a lot of stuff like that. Um, and you just put the gang into those situations, and that way you can do a lot of stuff that you couldn't do if it was just them.
Yeah, that makes sense. You said, Sholly, that your background is that you're developmental psychologist. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So is there, from your point of view, anything in terms of race and gender that's not appropriate developmentally for kids content?
I don't think of it as not appropriate. I think of it more as, how do you portray people? I over the past year or so, I've been teaching an online class on comics writing for the Q School, and we had a whole conversation about this in one class where somebody brought up a question like that, because about, well, what do you do if you're if you want to have you want to have diverse characters in your comic, but you're not part of those groups? And my basic answer is, you don't have to be an alien to write about aliens. I think it's great when it's somebody from that group who's doing it, because I think it winds up being a lot more authentic. But if you're going to write about some other group, then at the very least, make sure you've got friends who are in that group, so that you're not basing everything that you know about them on what you've seen on TV shows, or something like that. And to ask yourself honestly, why is it that I'm doing it? If you're doing it from the motivation of, I really want to see these things represented, I want to have readers be able to see themselves reflected in the stories and all of that, that's wonderful, and I'm all for that. If you're doing it because you think it's going to make your story look more hip and contemporary, or because it's a fad, like back in the 80s when suddenly they were replacing all the superheroes with minority females, and you're just doing it as a fashion statement, that I think that's probably not the best reason to do it.
Yeah, I think I might have meant the question the other way around, because I seem to remember 15 years ago or something, when a Muslim character got introduced in Sesame Street, that there was kind of there was a fuss about it, like, oh, can we do that? Is that right? Like, but developmentally, right? It's always good to show people what the world is.
Right. So I don't remember that specific incident, because I've been out of there for about 20 years now. But although I still do projects for them. But yeah, no, there's nothing wrong developmentally with it. It's all in how you do it. If you present people honestly and you present them authentically, then it's a great to open up kids to to other ways of being. If you're doing it as you're doing it stereotypically, then you're giving them a false idea of how it all is, and that's something we obviously want to avoid.
What about the parents' reactions, though, when the parents aren't ready for their kids to see things? Or I mean, certainly book banning has been a thing that has been a huge topic lately, because parts of the country are shifting more rightwards, I suppose, and more conservative, and they don't want their children exposed to ideas. That seems more harmful than the alternative.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it just happened with Mouse, right? In the school district where the school board voted not, to take Mouse out of the schools. And you know, and I only know what I read about in the newspapers, but you know, from what I read, I understand, I think, why they were doing it. And they were doing it because they were concerned about language, or concerned about nudity and all of that, but they weren't looking at the big picture of it. Which is why I think it was wrong. But I understood it, even if I disagreed with it. But look, I mean, you know, it doesn't just happen with parents and book parents. You know, I remember, you know, some years ago, I wrote the backup stories in Action Comics during Grant Morrison's run, and I had done one story about trying, you know, basically I wanted to show why Ma and Pa Kent were such great parents, and I did this story about their attempts over the years to have kids and unsuccessfully. And at one point, I had them go to their local minister, who kind of helps reassure them with some biblical references and whatever. And I saw this thing online on some message board or something where somebody was complaining about how, you know, and clearly it was somebody who was not religious, who was complaining about this minister, you know, making these false promises, and he wasn't really promising them anything. He was just kind of reassuring them, making these false promises to them about all this stuff, and it's so unbelievable, you know, and whatever. And somebody else replied, you know, but the guy flying in tights you find believable? You know? So, you know, everybody comes to this stuff with their own perceptions and their own baggage and their own whatever. And all we can do is really try to do the best we can do. And
it's also, that story is an interesting example of how culture changes too. I mean, Sholly knows this. The first time I met Sholly in person, I gushed to him about that story. As a middle-aged parent of an adopted child, like that story, and a Superman fan, that story just, you know, pulled my heart out and reminded me I had it, you know, like, but you have, you know, when the original Superman stories were published, you know, everyone had kids, you know, grown-ups had kids, families were big because, you know, that was the way the world was, you know, family size was big. Never, you know, in 30, 40, 50 years of Superman stories did everyone have a story about how come Superman's parents didn't already have a kid. You know, every story I've ever read about farm life, the family has a bunch of kids because someone has to do all the work. You know, Little House on the Prairie is not a story about a family that, you know, has a lot of employees. It's a story about a family whose children are involved in every part of running their house and their farm and eventually a business. Like, but in a modern context, it's like, well, this is a thing that's totally worth exploring. Why are these parents, why were they so ready to raise a child as their own that they didn't, you know, have the conventional way? And it was beautiful. I mean, but that's a thing that culturally was not a question, and now it is, and now it's answered. And you know, I'm working on, I mean, about a year and a half ago, I wrote a story for a DC holiday special that introduced a gender fluid character and Kid Quick, who's like a parallel Earth version of Kid Flash, sort of. And that character got a ton of attention. And I think part of the reason it got a ton of attention, was because it wasn't the point of the story. It wasn't a very special story about a gender fluid superhero.
Sure.
I think and I was prepared for that feedback. I was prepared, you know, it was an 8-page story in a holiday special. I was totally prepared for the feedback to be, we'd rather do this in its own thing. And like, I wouldn't have been offended by that. I'd be like, sure, of course, if you're going to get the news hit, you want it to be for the, you know, $2.99 monthly comic that can get people coming back every month, not a special that then doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. You know, I would totally have understood. And they were like, no, it's better. It's better in a lot of ways if it's just matter of fact. Like, in the world, there are people, and people are different from each other, and they're not all the same. And not every story is about my heterosexuality or, you know, like that.
Well, I mean, exactly. How many superhero stories about Batman and Superman are about the heterosexualally? You know, the romance, sure, maybe, but not. I don't know.
Or their gender identity. I mean, to be more specific, it's like, you know, I mean, apart from the word man being in their names, which I guess is a tell, But
Yeah. Yeah, people are people, and you know, you write stories about people. Ideally,
and I think I think the other thing that relates to something Sholly said earlier, it's like appreciating stories about characters that are different from ourselves. I think that has become better when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were doing Black Panther stories. They were cool, but they didn't necessarily speak to anything other than what those two guys had seen in movies about, you know, jungle adventures and maybe some science fiction stuff mixed together. You know, when you get to the 70s and, you know, the artist is a black guy, and then in the 80s and 90s where the writers, you know, have some of that in their background and have more friends of that background, I think the stories become richer and more involving. Same with Luke Cage, you know, same with a bunch of characters that were invented by middle-aged white guys.
Yeah.
But it's still, I think they become more relevant when there's some life experience that's relevant to it, that's infused into it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me.
But that being said, I've written Wonder Woman comics, and I'm not a woman from an Amazon culture.
You know, what?
I'm not.
Oh, okay. Oh, hold on. Let me make a. In terms of Batman and Scooby-Doo, has there been an idea of any kind that you thought of, or even got to the point of pitching, that you then went, yeah, no, that's not going to work in the Scooby-Doo universe? I'm thinking about, you know, maybe, I don't know, a character like Firefly, right, whose whole job is to set things on fire. You maybe you don't want to put that in a kid's comic. I don't know.
I think Sholly did.
I did. I have put Firefly. I put Firefly in Batman Brave and the Bold, and yes, he will be showing up at some point in Batman Scooby Mysteries. Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Phosphorus has similar issues, and I think he's also been.
Yeah, but he's in there too. He's in there. But
Mr. Zaz, maybe not.
I did not use that.
That would be a hard one to do in a kid's.
That was harder. That would be harder.
There's a lot of weird tattoos and violence.
Yeah.
It's all, you know what? It's all in the execution. I did an issue of Scooby team up with Swamp Thing, and again, because we can pick and choose, I took my favorite era of Swamp Thing, which was Alan Moore, Steve Bissette, John Tuttlebin, and I did that Swamp Thing in a Scooby-Doo story. And I started, the first page was like all of these tight close-ups of like birds and frogs and water and whatever, and it was this whole thing about, the silence is shattered by the, and so on and so forth, for a whole page. And then by page 2, it turns out that was Shaggy's narration, and Velma and Daphne are complaining about how melodramatic Shaggy gets. And I decided not to make Arcane the villain because I thought that would be hard to do in Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
But I did make Chester for lack of a better term, the old hippie pothead. I made him Shaggy's uncle, and I had Abby Arcane show up at the end, and when Shaggy talks about his uncle Chester, Abby makes some snide remark about uncles, and that's the sort of thing that Ivan was talking about before. What I enjoy doing in this stuff, and it's something that I learned from the Adam West Batman show, it's something I learned from Sesame Street, is writing these things on 2 levels. You write it, there's the kid level that you're writing it on, where it's funny, it's action, it's adventure, it's mysteries, it's all that stuff that kids love, and you can just appreciate it on that level. But then if you're an older fan who actually knows this stuff, then there are the references and the in-jokes and all of that you get on a completely other level. And the trick is writing that stuff in such a way that if you don't have the background knowledge for it, you don't feel like you're missing anything. It's not an obvious standing out of, oh, I don't understand that.
Right.
But it just sort of goes over your head, and that's fine. and you appreciate the stuff that you do get.
Yeah.
But it's that extra layer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I suspect all three of us at the times where we started reading comics, there wasn't really a delineation. Like, all comics were for everybody. Like, the idea of the all ages comic as a comic that's written for children is very modern. Like, it was, you know, the comic I read in 1980 or 1975 was not, you know, it was probably a little above my head vocabulary wise, is where I learned big words. You know, why do I know what geosynchronous means? Well, it's because the Justice League satellite was 22,300 miles above the Earth. Everyone knows that, right? Turned out my science teacher didn't, but I knew, you know. But the stuff is written, you know, and I think we both, you know, you try to, you know, you simplify the vocabulary a little, you simplify the concepts a little to make sure that it's something a kid can read and follow without needing to go to mom or dad for explanation. But you know, you make things clear enough, and then if, you know, I have grown-up friends who read the comics with their kids and they tell me that they appreciate, you know, their jokes that they appreciate that their kids didn't even know were jokes, and I'm like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. I think it's issue 10 of Batman Scooby where the special guest, because why not add more characters, was the Renee Montoya question, and she's in it. And I mainly started putting her in there because I had a joke in mind for like a who's on first type thing with, you know, that's the question. I know, I'm asking you, you know, and that was fun.
Right.
You made me laugh, by the way.
Thank you. That you're my target audience. That, and also for viewers who don't know, the question's mask is like a featureless face. So the main thing that Shaggy and Scooby are fascinated by is, well, how do you eat? And she's like, nobody has ever asked me that question. Like, nobody, you know, only the most food obsessed people in the world would ask, you know, that's your problem. You know, not how can you see, not how do you breathe. It's like, but what about food? But the issue came out, and, you know, I'm still new enough at this part of it that I hunt for reviews, even though kids' comics don't get reviewed very much. And there was more than one review that talked about how there's a female supporting character that they're sure was romantically interested in Renee Montoya, who is one of the first major DCU characters who's gay, you know, female characters who's gay. And I don't think I had thought about that at all. But then reading it, I was like, oh, that's totally what that is. But it's like, it's all perception. There's nothing in the writing that says it.
Right.
The lady at the end is just like, where's that nice Miss Montoya? I want to thank her. You know, that kind of thing. And I'm like, if that read that way to somebody, that's great. You know, let them think, you know, let the world be that much more varied and interesting. You know.
Now you said that that you don't get a lot of reviews and presumably a lot of feedback from the audience on the kids' comics. I think particularly I would guess because, you know, at DC and at Marvel, kids' comics are not. I don't know if they're not respected by the comic shop audience, but there's something going on there, you know. Is this hard to sort of, I don't know, write in a vacuum, or is it easier because you don't have to worry about like making the audience applaud you?
Well, okay, so I'll say first of all, if you're looking for the audience to applaud you, you have no business being on the internet.
That's true.
But I learned years ago that the only way to look at reviews on the internet or things of that sort is to go in with the attitude that some people are going to like what I've done and some people are wrong. And if you don't do that, then you'll walk away with no self-esteem left. But yeah, you know what? When I was writing stuff for Action, there was tons and tons and tons of fan stuff online. When I do stuff for Batman Scooby, a little tiny amount of fan stuff online. But there are a couple of things about that. One is while it is a mixed bag, as anything is on the internet, the stuff that does get fan reaction is the kind of stuff I was talking about. It's generally from people who actually got the joke. And so like when I did the story about pup named Scooby-Doo and the young Bruce Wayne, that got several online reviews from people who knew exactly what I was doing. And that was kind of nice to see that people got the joke. But what's really kind of rewarding, and this happens very, very, very infrequently nowadays, every couple of years, DC will forward me a letter from a kid. And those are wonderful. I remember when Super Friends was canceled, my favorite online reaction was a post that some father put up that was titled, "Dan DiDio just made my 5-year-old cry." And it was this wonderful piece about how the kid was so devoted to Super Friends and loved Super Friends and all of that. So I wrote him a reply and sent the kid a message in Super Friends code, and that's the stuff that really just makes it worthwhile, because you see, that's what superheroes are good at. It's inspiring kids, and and it's introducing them to this whole fantasy world and imagination and all of that stuff, and just helping them to learn to be good people. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, I miss that level of feedback. I miss doing, I mean, one of the many, things that has been sad about the last 2 years. Like, I'm sad to be doing this comic at a time where there aren't really a ton of like store comics. There's not, not as much convention stuff, or not as much convention stuff that we're necessarily super comfortable doing for a big stretch of time. I like doing talks at schools. I mean, I only did a few of those, but talking to 5th graders about how comics are made was super fun. And getting that kind of experience. I mean, sure, all the questions are about, did you ever write Avengers? And it's like, yes, I wrote one Avengers 8-page story in Italy. Yeah, it's still cool. There's still a lot of credit involved in that, but yeah, no, you don't do. I mean, it's nice when you want your peers to have read stuff.
Sure.
I mean, that's I found that, on the professional level, it's a little a little frustrating. It's like, hey, give me more work. I've been writing one of the most popular Batman comics for the last year.
Right.
No, you haven't. I'm like, no, I really have.
Yeah.
You just don't read it because you don't have children.
Yeah.
But you don't do it for the. I mean, no, you don't do it for the reviews. It's just. It's nice. It's nice to be noticed, Brian. That's
I just, I do have to say, I miss the day, and it's been 15 years or more, but I miss those days when the DC Kids comics actually still had the letters pages, and kids would draw, their little pictures of Batman and send them in, and that was fun, and I kind of miss those days, I gotta say.
Yeah, I love that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So one more question. This one's for Sholly's particularly because you wrote 100 issues of Scooby-Doo team up. What was your favorite Scooby-Doo team up?
Oh, it's hard to pick one. All right. It's a. All right, I'll pick one of my favorites. Scooby-Doo team up number 13 is Scooby-Doo team up with Deadman, the Phantom Stranger, and the Spectre. And it includes every ghost character that I could find from DC or any of the companies that DC owns. And I built the entire story around one scene, which was, without going through the whole thing, all of these ghost characters have been kidnapped for some nefarious reason, basically, and the Spectre among them. And the Spectre has been put into some kind of, suspended state because he's been separated from his human body and it's weakened him. And the only way that he can recover is by uniting with, you know, a living body. And so we have this wonderful page of Scooby in the Spectre's cowl and cape saying, "Vengeance!"
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. All right. So to wrap this up, the last two questions are like the first question. I always have the same questions for the last two. The first one is there anything that you guys would like to plug that's coming up that that maybe the kids haven't seen, or maybe they're not quite aware of, or, you know, and you can just go, yeah, no, issue 12 of Batman Scooby, that's fine. But if there was something else you wanted to plug away.
You want to go first then?
Sure. I will go first and say that this lovely book is still available in fine stores everywhere. And if you didn't like the movie, the book has a ton of stuff that wasn't in it because we couldn't use a bunch of characters. So instead, it's got more superheroes and Looney Tunes stuff. And if you love the movie, it is exactly what the movie was. It is precisely that. Everything is exactly the way you loved it. Apart from that, I have a Looney Tunes issue coming up in May, where Bugs seems to travel to the future and encounters humorless robot versions of Daffy and others and has to inspire a revolution of lunacy. And in, I can't talk about it. In June, a DC grown-up miniseries debuts, co-written by me. That will be really fun and is super exciting, and it's going to be announced in a few weeks with many bells and whistles. And it has cool, appropriate variant covers to help the retail community, you know, do stuff.
Don't talk to me about variant covers. I'm not.
I know. These are good. And there aren't 20 of them.
Okay. Very good.
It's also, and it's the best work I've ever done. I'm
Nice.
very excited about it, and I'm not modest enough to think that other work I've done isn't good. So this is, I'm very excited about that. And then there's Batman Scooby-Doo Volume 2 comes out at some point in the future.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a second year?
No, that's Volume 2 of the trade.
The trade. Okay.
So you will get all of the good stuff because, you know, I think Sholly and I both went, you know, nuttier in the second half than we did the first half. So
nice.
Lots of guests, lots of excitement.
Yeah. Great. Sholly, anything you want to plug?
So sure. So I'm doing all my usual DC stuff, you know, Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, that kind of stuff. I have and we're doing this under the auspices of DC, but I have a series that I just finished writing for Dynamite that is Mad Balls versus Garbage Pail Kids. If you can remember either of those. But I think the coolest thing that's coming up is this graphic novel, which I'm going to try to share my screen.
Oh, that's screen share?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Batman's Mystery Casebook. This is a book. It's a trade paperback. Not a trade paperback, excuse me. It's a graphic novel of solve it yourself mysteries with Batman. So that basically gives you the opportunity to match wits with the world's greatest detective and see if you can solve the cases before he does.
Nice.
So that's going to be a lot of fun, and that's going to be out in, I think, August.
Great.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Is that coming from DC proper, or?
Yeah, it's coming from DC proper.
Nice. Very good. Excellent. I love that. Well, very good. And then, so the last question is you know, this is a series of videos that we do. We have, you know, in addition to the kids watching it, I mean, we're like up to about 250 interviews here. We do have a lot of people who want to make comics watching these shows. And, you know, one of the things I really frequently hear from people is, you know, I want to make comics, but I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. What should I do? So, is there a piece of advice that you would give to someone who wants to make comics? It can be something, you know, craft and physical, but it could also be something emotional. It could be something, you know, kind of spiritual. It could be anything you want. What would you say to someone who came up to you and goes, "I'm interested in making comics. What do I do?"
I'd say go do it. I mean, it depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about just making comics for the love of making comics and not because you particularly want to, get a job at DC or Marvel or something, there is no better time than now to be doing that, because anybody can make comics and anybody can post comics and spread them and distribute them far and wide, through the miracle of, a couple of key presses. So there's no reason for anybody not to make comics if that's what they want to do. If the thing is you want to get a job at one of these big companies and start, writing Batman or Spider-Man or something like that, that's a little trickier. And I think from Ivan's story and my story both, you really see that a lot of it is really kind of being in the right place at the right time. I mean, obviously you have to have talent and whatever, but like take the Batman Mystery Casebook graphic novel, for example. I first pitched that idea to DC, I think probably about maybe 15 years ago.
Wow.
Back when Batman the Animated Series was on TV and they were doing a comic spinoff. And I said, well, what if we did a spinoff of that was a mini series that was this? And Paul Levitz was still the publisher back then. And he liked the idea, but he thought it would be better as a book. And so I went to the book people at DC, and they weren't doing graphic novels at that time. And they just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to market it. They didn't know what to do with it. And so it sat in a drawer until after I did the Teen Titans Go graphic novel. And I said to Chrissy, hey, that was really kind of fun. How about doing another graphic novel? And she said, well, why don't you pitch me some ideas? And I started trying to think of an idea, and I said, oh, wait a second, I already have an idea. And the exact same thing 15 years later, now it's coming out. It's the right place at the right time.
It's amazing. I would just add, I agree with Sholly 100%. The other thing, though, about right place, right time is also being the right person. So if you want to create comics, read lots of comics, read lots of everything, know what's going on, try to get to write something, whether it's comics or prose, be good at it so that when the opportunity presents itself, you're able to take advantage of it. If I had never written a freelance piece for anyone on a deadline for which I got paid, it's possible that I would not have gotten that opportunity to write a fill-in issue of a comic. It's possible that I would have gotten to do one and it would have been late and bad, and then I wouldn't have gotten a chance to do a second one. Like there's a lot, opportunity is, the currency, is the thing, but you have to be ready to take advantage of it. And part of that too is know what you're good at. Not everyone is good at writing and drawing. I'm terrible at drawing. I don't think Sholly is, boasting of his art prowess. Some people are great at both, and that's amazing. But, if you're good at drawing, there are certainly books to help you refine that. Scott Kobush, I think, just did one, or is doing some for DC that I'm sure are great because Scott really knows how to tell a story, and he's an amazing artist. If you want to write, I think the paths are many, including just reading them. Know the language. Yeah. I mean, part of what I think is great about Sholly, and I think I've said this to him directly, and I'll say it here. I think Sholly speaks Scooby-Doo as a native language in a way that I definitely don't. So his ability to create great, fun, original Scooby stories that feel like, that are genuine Scooby stories is really special. And that's something that develops over time. You don't just wake up one morning able to write Scooby-Doo stories. You have to sort of drink it and bathe in it. But yeah, create comics, tell stories. Anyone who wants to tell stories should be telling stories because they probably have things to say, and I encourage it.
Love it. I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank the two of you for taking the time to sit and babble with me about all this stuff today. Hopefully you had a good time.
It was great, Brian.
Yeah.
Excellent. Always nice to find somebody who will actually listen, so thank you.
Yeah. Well, very good. Very good. You want to put me back on a onezo? Thanks. So yeah, if you're sitting there at home and you're not quite sure what you want to read, and Lord knows we all have time to read these days. The Batman and Scooby-Doo Mysteries. This was a great deal of fun, and any kid out there is going to love it, and any kid at heart is going to love it as well. I thoroughly recommend this. Next month's kid book is Hooky by Miriam. I'm gonna mangle this. Miriam Bonastre-Tour. And this was a webcomic originally on Webtoons, and she is in Spain, so we will be talking to her live from Spain next month for our next Kids Club book. So look for that. Next Sunday for the adult club, though this is actually an adult club book that would be fine for kids. This is a Finnish story called Oxy. It's a fairy tale. And it's really beautiful, and it's got this really gorgeous, beautiful art, and it's smart, and I loved it a lot. So that's next Sunday. And then the next Classic Club, we're going to be talking to Peter Bagg about Buddy Goes to Jersey. So that's the next set of shows. We'd love you to watch all of them. In the meantime, I would like to thank my producer, Jordan, for being my producer. I would like to thank Zoe and Ben for running the show. I would like to thank my staff, Kat, Zoe, and Katie, for running the store and allowing me to sit here and talk to people. I like to thank all of the viewers who are doing this. I would like to thank all the people who make comics, particularly these two, for being here. Thank you for making comics, because I couldn't sell them if it wasn't for you guys making them. And thank you all. So that's what I got. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for watching this episode of the Kids Graphic Novel of the Month Club. If you enjoyed what you were seeing, please subscribe and hit the bell up in the corner. We'd like to invite you to join the club. Every month you'll get a great new book curated by our staff, and it's a fantastic program. So please join. That address is running along the bottom right now. Thanks very much.